Should be good in a moment. Okay, so all right, well, we're live right now. We just started streaming, so uh, everybody, thank you for this is the 8th episode of the Squat the Planet podcast. Today I am joined by Wren and Stix, who are former people that worked formerly with Homes Not Jails in the San Francisco Bay Area region, and we're just going to talk with them about some of the stuff that they did through Homes Not Jails, and kind of like hear some stories and whatnot about what all that was like. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Stix, for joining us. Thank you, Wren. I appreciate y'all being here with us. As some people might notice, we don't have any video. We had some technical difficulties with some of the, video and sound and programs and whatnot. So you're going to be looking at like a slideshow, some very lovely pictures while we talk. And hope you enjoy that. So first off, let's just start off like Stix, can you introduce yourself and kind of what you will be talking about today?
Well, my name is Stix. I was a member of HNJ mainly in 2012, a little bit of 2013. Some of the things I had suggested for topics to discuss was just meeting structure and group structure in general, public building takeovers, and I think there was something else that is escaping me that I messaged you about.
Okay. Cool.
But I also am interested in hearing what Wren thinks would be a good topic to discuss, because they didn't have the opportunity to communicate with you as extensively beforehand as I did.
Absolutely. Speaking of which, Wren, will you introduce yourself? Maybe can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your involvement in HNJ?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was involved in H&J from 2011 through 2013 in H&J in San Francisco, and then there's like another H&J project that was started in another city that I was also like briefly involved with, the less involved. Gosh, what do I want to talk about today? Like I had all these ideas, but they like went out of my head. I definitely want to talk about like H&J when I got there and how the dynamics of H&J changed once the city started really like gentrification in San Francisco really kicked up, and what that meant for sort of like squatting in San Francisco, and also kind of like maybe some of like the good things about living and helping to create like liberated spaces, but also the challenges, and also maybe oh God, what was I gonna say? Oh, I don't remember, but I might remember.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, you just reminded me of the other thing that I had intended to talk about, and that was the squatting movements that broke out in a lot of different cities in the post-foreclosure bubble burst.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh,
cool.
and I remember what it was. So I wanted to talk about like H&J because it kind of has always had these like different kind of like iterations of H&J throughout the years, and sort of like when we were involved, like what the group kind of was, the dynamics as we understand them, like when it was founded and started in 1992, and then what kind of collective that we were a part of kind of creating, and how it sort of changed over time.
Okay, cool. That sounds good. I'm kind of curious. How did the two of you know each other? Like through working at the same time?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. And did you know each other before working with HNJ, or did you meet like through it?
We met through it.
Through it.
Yeah, we I think we maybe met in an H&J meeting, which I don't really remember. But then I do remember that you like spent the night in my squat, and that was like really the first time I really sort of talked about you. or talk not about you, talk to you, you know? So I started to
Hmm.
get to know you better after that.
Cool. I'm curious. Had either of you had extensive like experience like squatting buildings before working with Homes Not Jails?
Six.
I
So,
did have some, but nowhere near at the technically sophisticated level that I learned to do it through Homes Not Jails.
okay. And
Yeah.
Ren?
For me, it was my first time like squatting in vacant buildings. I had like gone through periods of like living off and on in my car, but it was
Hmm.
my first time like really squatting in buildings.
Okay. And what got each of you started on the idea of like squatting buildings? I mean, was it just through people that you knew that were doing it, or you said that you'd been doing it a little bit beforehand? Um, how did you first hear about like squatting?
Um, it was something that I had initially done in a circle of people that I was using hard drugs with, honestly, and then I quit doing it for a very long time. And the second time that I started doing it again, it was out of necessity, and I had fallen on hard times, and I didn't really know anybody else who was doing it besides myself at that point in my life.
Okay.
Um,
What
Yeah.
what about you, Ren?
Um, Gosh, for me, it was sort of a lot of a culmination of like a lot of sort of like things. Like I was like living in San Francisco and I was like paying rent, but I also was like really struggling to do so. And like I was like becoming in danger of sort of like losing my housing. And at that same time, I started to be involved in sort of like different sorts of like tenants' rights sort of things in San Francisco. And I ended up being introduced to Homes Not Jails. I actually like had a friend invite me to a building takeover, and so when I went to that building takeover, it was like one of the most amazing things I'd ever really experienced. And I decided to like stop really doing more of the like sort of tenants' rights sort of situation and really because I found that sort of nonprofit model to be really lacking, and it started to be part of H&J. Yeah.
Interesting. You said you were you were a little bit I don't want to say disheartened. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but with you weren't happy with how the tenancy was doing it. That's what. Am I getting that correctly?
Well, just yeah, I mean, just the like nonprofit sort of model to begin with, like just that it's like sort of this like system where it creates this dependency, you know, and like where people are handing you resources and you're asking them for resources and you like have to depend on other people sort of like giving you things perpetually. And it really
Hmm.
like, while I think it's important because it can help, like in San Francisco, it can help keep people in like rent controlled units when there's gentrification and this sort of stuff. Like it just isn't enough. It doesn't really address the problems in San Francisco of like having, you know, more vacant units than there are people who are homeless, you know? And I just found like it really wasn't, it was kind of glossing over those issues and sort of like wanting to have like a lot of like those sorts of nonprofits that are involved in like legislation and that sort of stuff around like housing. And I'm just like have no interest in being involved in that.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So, what was the difference between working with a tenants union and Homes Not Jails? Like, what was it that like filled those gaps for you?
God, it was just totally different. So like when I was doing like tenants counseling, like people would come to me and they would ask like, I have this problem with my landlord. I'm in danger of eviction. What can I do? Right. And I would help connect them to like resources and services, like write letters, these sorts of things, like call around to different offices in San Francisco. But it like was very much based on this sort of dependency model where like they came to me and I gave them things and then I gave them access to things and then they asked more people and then they gave them more access to things, like sort of this like piecemeal way of like approaching the threat of like being houseless in San Francisco. And at H&J it was totally different because it wasn't based on this dependency model, like at least when I was involved in it. Like it was really focused on one, like opening up as many places as possible, holding them as long as possible, and also like teaching people directly about squatting so that people could like take those skills and like really take care of themselves and create sort of their own communities and like liberated spaces. So it was like more of sort of like a horizontal thing as opposed to like, I have access to X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to give this to you. Instead, we were like all kind of coming together for like a common goal. It's really quite different.
Cool. Yeah, I like how you describe that, like as in terms of like horizontal versus trickle down or whatnot. Stix, I'm kind of curious. Like, did you have any experiences with tenants unions, or did you just kind of like jump right into the homes not jails thing?
I didn't have any experience with either the San Francisco Tenants Union or any other tenants' rights groups. I didn't really have any experience with like homeless advocacy or homeless activism prior to the 2011 Occupy movement either. That was how I was introduced to homes not jails.
Okay. And what was it that interested you at the time? You said you got into it through Occupy, but were you squatting at the time that you decided to become involved, or during Occupy, or what was your situation that led up to that?
I was living in a car at the time, and I had just come to San Francisco. I think I arrived Christmas Eve 2011.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm kind of curious. Like, do either of you like still have contacts with Homes Not Jails these days, or is Homes Not Jails even still around? To be honest, I had a hard time kind of determining that.
Stix, do you know the answer to that more than me?
It's not really still happening, in my opinion. It hasn't been happening for a long time. There was a group of people that tried to get a similar project started in Oakland, but it seemed like it never really got off the ground the way it had the years prior.
Yeah.
Oakland. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, it just seemed like, yeah, it never really did sort of like take on the sort of magnitude or scale that it did in San Francisco. But what I do know is that a lot of people who are involved in San Francisco, like they're still involved in like having a resource library available to people who are squatting, who like need things like tools, etc., so that they have like a place to come and like use those tools in order to like still open up spaces. So that sort of resource still exists. But no, like San Francisco Homes Not Jails doesn't exist as we knew it.
Okay. You said those resources still exist. Is that like at an info shop, like the Long Haul, or where can people find those things?
At the Omni Commons.
Omni Commons. Okay, I haven't heard of this place.
Yeah, it's like a newer space. I don't really know. Maybe like a few years ago it was started in like kind of the borderline between Oakland and Berkeley. But there's like a sort of supply closet there that has tools and stuff that people can, borrow and use to open up spaces. I don't know how active they are in doing that. But the last time like I sort of attended those sorts of meetings regularly, like that resource was still there. So like Homes Not Jail sort of like didn't exist as we knew it, but like there's always been sort of like these tools that have built up over time, like physical resources that like have continued to be kind of like passed down through different sorts of like phases of H&J. So those are still there. Like, so it's like, well, where do you get bolt cutters? Well, there might be like, we might have bolt cutters to offer. Like, where do you get, sort of things like that.
Key grinder.
Yeah, the key grinder.
I hope.
Is that a grinder as in like for making keys?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
And Stix is super good at things regarding locks and repinning them and key making.
Cool, nice. That's a useful skill to have. Well, I'm kind of curious. I'm just trying to get like kind of a bird's eye view for myself and the audience too of just like H&J and what it was, where it is now, and just kind of like give an overview of how it worked and whatnot. And so, do either of you kind of like have no like, did it just kind of fade out, or did it just kind of like slowly burn out at some point, or did it just kind of come to a close? Do you know anything about that?
Well, there was a confluence of factors. I think one thing that we both touched on when we talked about subjects we wanted to talk about could essentially be summed up in that squatting movements tend to break out in times of economic decline when jobs are drying up and people are moving out of an area, or there's a lot of abandonment and vacancy, and tend to get pushed out when an area is getting gentrified. And that's happened many times in many different cities throughout history. So in the aftermath of the foreclosure crisis, there was a lot of vacant bank-owned properties that were actually in saleable condition, that had nothing wrong with them, often had the utilities still on, sitting empty. And I've heard about Detroit and Pittsburgh and Miami and Boston had a lot of like mass squatting movements around that time.
Yeah, and so when sort of gentrification started picking up in San Francisco, there were just like less and less vacant properties. And not only that, but the ones that were vacant were sort of patrolled more heavily, or sort of like monitored more heavily, because you had these like places that would be like all but almost forgotten about for a period of time. And so it just got more and more difficult to squat. Like when I go to San Francisco and I walk around, like I can like see all of these buildings that people used to squat in, and like, all of a sudden there's like a new coat of paint and like the whole building, like new windows, and like it's been like totally redone in sort of like the push for gentrification, like sort of like in that sort of thing. And so, and like the buildings have been sold and flipped and all this other sort of stuff. So like so many places that used to exist just simply don't anymore.
Okay. Well, let's rewind a little bit. I mean, you both were talking about your first involvements in Homes Not Jails. Was I believe Wren? Did you say it was in 2011?
Mm-hmm.
And was that a particular action or something that they were putting on that was your first time getting involved with that?
Yeah, there was an action. There was an action in the Mission to District of San Francisco to like take over a building, and with Homes Not Jails, like usually those start with there'll be like a meetup at like a central location, and then everybody will march to the building and then take it over. So I was sort of like, that was like my first real exposure to Homes Not Jails. Yeah.
Okay.
And
were you actively staying at the location that they were marching to, or you're just like there for support?
No, I was just there for support. A lot of times with like H&J actions, it's really to like the places that are taken over aren't necessarily viable as squats for whatever reason, but like those places tend to tell a really important story about like homelessness in San Francisco, and like kind of like where people sort of put like profit and private property like above human beings and their ability to be housed. And so that place in particular, so usually with actions, people might occupy it for like a day, maybe two, maybe not much longer, because again, they're not super viable properties for squatting. But what it does is it like generates a lot of awareness about squatting and about why people are squatting and about like what's happening in the area regarding homelessness and vacancies, because a lot of people don't actually understand, at least that I found at actions, like they didn't know that so many places existed that were vacant when they see so many people sleeping on the street, and they just like couldn't like really understand why that was, you know? And so that's like what the actions were, is to like, you know, create that sort of dissonance to have people sort of question, you know, the like sort of system that we live in.
Absolutely. And that makes me think of something else too. When I was living in Philadelphia, in a squat long, let's say probably 2001, 2002, something like that. There was a lot of posters around that people had put up, like showing the numbers. I think it was like 40,000 abandoned houses and like 20,000 homeless people, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering, do either of you recall any of the numbers? I mean, San Francisco is obviously a huge area, but do you remember if there's like some kind of ratio like that?
Yeah, I know. Sorry, go ahead, Stix.
The 3.5 to 1 ratio tends to be pretty consistent in terms of there's about 3.5 times as many vacant housing units as there are homeless. As far as specific numbers, I can't remember what like the homeless population of San Francisco was or is at the time.
Mm-hmm. But I know that like when I got involved, there were like, I think like 32,000 vacant rental units in San Francisco, about that.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think that's interesting that the 3 to 1 ratio seems to be consistent, at least probably in most major cities, I would think. Yeah, that's really interesting. That's just one of the things that's always fascinated me personally. It's just the fact that there's like such a disparity between the two, you know, like the amount of abandoned houses and homeless people. So those posters, like I said, were, you know, they always just made a big impact on me when I was younger. I was like, holy shit, you know. Like, mm-hmm. So anyways, Stix, what was your? Can you describe your first involvement with Homes Not Jails? Was it a particular action, like Wren was saying?
Well, my first involvement with them, I got a couple of people to help me open up a house for myself, like maybe the first month that I was there, and it ended up not lasting a very long time.
How long did it last?
Well, I think I stayed there less than a month before giving it away to somebody else. Somebody invited me to come stay at a much nicer place that I had never seen a house that nice being squatted before. Kind of a jaw dropper for me, being new to the area and the group. Nice. There was a building takeover that happened not too long after I started getting involved with the group. I want to say maybe around after I'd been doing it for a month or so.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe a month and a half.
So you're saying
that was something that.
Sorry, go ahead.
I still have a hard time describing to people just what a jaw-dropping experience it was to see,
because of the
being
quality,
openly liberated like that.
Because of the quality of the housing, or just because it was your first experience?
Oh, because of the nature of the event of taking over a vacant space as a form of civil disobedience.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
I think it was a hotel building that was the first occupation I ever attended.
Nice. How long were you there for?
It lasted overnight until the early hours of the morning.
Okay. And what was the end result? Did the police show up and evict, or did everyone just leave voluntarily?
Most of the people left voluntarily before the police finally rushed the building.
Okay. So was it kind of...
I didn't stay till the very end.
Okay. So kind of like a, I guess, how would you describe it? Like Wren was saying with, you know, just bringing attention to abandoned spaces like that. So I take it was kind of like that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a place that had hundreds of rooms with beds still in it. There was still working electricity and plumbing.
Yeah.
And was that place like slated for demolition or renovation?
Yeah, they ended up demolishing it. Ren, do you remember what they put in the place?
Yeah, they there's a hospital now there. They demolished. I think if we're talking about the same place that I think we're talking about. Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious. I really would like to hear. I guess maybe. Well, one of the things is don't be afraid to bring up you things. There's a couple of things that each of you mentioned that you want to touch on during the show. So if you want to bring that up at any point, let me know. I didn't get a chance to write those things down, so if you want to bring me back around to them at any point, just let me know. I kind of just have some like general questions that I wanted to ask each of you. Like one of which is, I think when you brought up the really nice squats, like one thing that came to mind was I'm kind of curious for each of you, like what's the nicest abandoned property you've ever squatted?
Oh dear.
Wow.
It's the sort of place that I will, unless I'm squatting it again, I'll never live in again for the rest of my life. Like it was like that sort of like unbelievable. Like it was like the fanciest property I'd ever personally, like aside from like maybe like sort of like, you know, private property like home that I'd ever been in my entire life. Like
so
ever.
Was this like a mansion or something, or?
Six.
It was, I guess you describe it as it's a luxury apartment.
Okay, interesting. So what was the story behind this luxury apartment? I take it both of you were there, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Both.
Cool. I'm just curious, like, what's the story behind this?
Oh gosh. Well, so it was already squatted prior to me coming there. But like it was like sort of in like the 2008 sort of like foreclosure mess. Like it was one of those properties that had gotten kind of like lost in it. So like there were issues over like who had the title, what bank had it, what bank didn't have it, like, you know, who does it actually belong to?
Mm-hmm.
And so people kind of like noticed that this building was vacant. They had occupied it and lived there covertly until at some point, you know, they were discovered by the sort of like real estate agent, whoever it was, like associated with the property. And so she brought the police there to try to evict people. But the police ruled it a civil matter, not a criminal matter, which basically meant that in order for people to be evicted, they would have to go through like, you know, like formal eviction proceedings, you know, like as tenants essentially. And because the deed of the property wasn't really clear, they really couldn't do that. Like what entity would it be that would be evicting, you know, like that wasn't clear. So the squad sort of got to exist for sort of a longer period of time than it would otherwise.
Cool. Yeah, I always hear a lot of stories of squatting it seems like some of the best cases of squatting involves that kind of ambiguous who's the owner type of situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it just makes it hard for anyone to like really sort of like have even like the legal ability to really challenge easily, at least your, you know, occupancy of it. And especially since after 2008, there were like laws sort of passed in California, et cetera, like sort of to protect tenants in foreclosed properties. So it was also sort of like in that context where like there was, you know, there was some risk to actually like evicting like actual like legal tenants, you know, So like I think that left to a lot of hesitancy in the system at that time to like evict people as quickly as they would otherwise. That's not always the case, but it seemed to be more the case at that time.
Yeah. And Stix, what was your opinion of this place that Wren's speaking of?
Well, it was a lovely place. Wren was the one who invited me to come there for the first time. I lived there for about a year. I definitely saw it go through some ups and downs. There was some crazy times. One of the things that struck me about it was the contrast between the interior of the house itself and the people who were living in it. So there was this very ornate woodwork and this 2-story high ceiling in the living room and this loft room and a 6-burner range top stove. But the people living in it were very gritty and very packed in. There was 2 sets of couches in the living room pushed together so couples could cuddle, and you know, tools and disassembled blocks laying all over the coffee table.
How many people were living at that space?
Oh, would you say it varied? I would say, right, Stix?
I mean, it definitely varied, and the different units were different in that regard too. Yeah. Like some of them housed a more transient community than others.
Well, do you have a ballpark, just in general? I mean, it would go from such a number to whatever number.
Well, when people first started squatting there, I don't remember if it was like 1 or 3 people, something like that. And then at one point, like at least in and maybe not in the whole house, but in the unit I'm like referencing, you know, and then it was like 2 people, and then it ballooned to like, you know, there were 2 bedrooms. There was like a loft area. The loft area at one point had like 4 beds on it and like couples in every bed, you know? So like, and then the living room down below, like every couch was full. Somebody had like made a sleeping arrangement like on top of the dining room table and underneath of it, you know? People like sleeping on the floor. Like it really like depended. There are also just a lot of people who like sort of traveled through and stayed there. So like, how many people would you say it Stix like at once? Like, maybe. I mean,
it seems like it tended to be around 7 people in our unit. But again, there was 4 units to the building.
Okay, that's actually going to be my next question: is how many? You keep referencing units, so not just one house, but like many living areas in a building. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was a multi-unit building.
Okay.
And each unit was like connected, but also like semi-autonomous too.
Okay, interesting.
They were like two bedroom units.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's another one of the things too. I think that I find interesting is that when people occupy buildings like this, how many people you can house. You know, I mean, you know, if you do it like, you know, I don't know, punk rock style or whatever, you can cram a lot of people in. But either way, it's just like, I think it's an interesting use of space just in general. I mean, because you just think about like, okay, if that's one building, how many people you're enabling to get off the sleeping on the streets, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but was there anything like else like super interesting about this building, or it was just like the size of it or the location? I'm just kind of curious, trying to get a mental picture here. You always hear like stories in the news, I think, and stuff of like people squatting mansions and whatnot. And obviously that's not the case like 99% of the time, but it is funny to hear some of those stories where, you know, people do squat like something really fancy. Uh, so I don't know. Was this so? Basically, though, this was probably like was this the fanciest place that you'd stayed at?
For me,
It,
absolutely.
it was, but I think one of the other things that was so striking about it was that it wasn't just this party space. It was very much a
Yeah.
workspace and a political space where we we weren't just living it up in this posh mansion. We went out and worked on opening up new houses for other people on a nightly basis,
Mm-hmm.
and painted banners for upcoming marches, and like did skill shares, and uh, put things together and took things apart. And
That's interesting you say that too, because I think a lot of people do get the like impression, oh, there's a bunch of kids partying in an abandoned house or something, or like other people think like, oh, look at all those people living for free in a mansion or something like that. The kind of little bit of a sneer, But like, I think some people might assume that like I don't know, maybe you're just partying or something like that. But the way you're describing it, especially with homes not jails, like is a workspace as well as a living space. Is that pretty much correct?
I would say for
yeah,
sure. I mean, one thing about too, like living in a space like that allows people, like, I was really busy during that time. Like, I didn't have to try to like work and, make money in any way to support myself. Like, I had so much time. And that time was like, I was super busy because that time allowed me to like dedicate it to a bunch of projects, and it like allowed everybody in that space to dedicate it to a bunch of projects, and like really was like a center of sort of like political organizing during that time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I definitely wouldn't have called it like, I would not have called it. I've lived in other housing that I would call like party housing, quote, and it was just not that sort of feel or environment at all. Um,
Yeah. Hmm.
yeah.
yeah. One thing that was striking about it, and contrary to a lot of the people's, I think, assumptions when I first tried to tell them about this place, was that it was an incredibly sober house. It wasn't
Yeah.
a strictly straight edge space, but you you weren't allowed to smoke pot inside the house. You could smoke it in the yard. People really didn't drink very much.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, People use their time constructively towards projects.
Yeah.
Yeah. It actually, the space like really, I mean, I actually got sober living in a squat. So like to like sort of like, like change that sort of perception that, and it's totally fine to have a squat too, which is a party space. Like there's nothing absolutely wrong with that. But it actually was like a place that allowed me to get sober, if that gives like any sort of impression of it.
Cool.
Like,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think one of the things that I really kind of advocate personally to people, especially on Squat the Planet, is like if you're going to live a lifestyle of like nomadic travel and things like that, is I always encourage people to obviously you're going to have a lot more free time if you're not like participating in the system and like say like spending like 2 weeks or more of your time working a job just to have a roof over your head and things like that, that you should try and give back something to the community. And I always feel like some of the best squats and squatting movements, I always hear about like how people like uh, take back like possession of their time,
hmm.
and because we do spend like so much time just trying to pay for like the simple things that we all agree with that we need as human beings, like shelter and food and all that stuff. And then while other people kind of profit off of those needs, especially in terms of like shelter. So I think that's another one of the things that I love about squatting is not just like the activist aspects, but also like kind of winning back some of your own personal time, which like you're saying is I personally believe, and I try to push for people to use at least some of that time to give back to their community or their grassroots local neighbors or the friends, whatever, let's give back somehow, right? So anyways, um, I think actually I have a couple of questions in the chat. if you all want to touch on these real quick.
Mhm.
Do either of you have experience like squatting on the East Coast, or is it all just the mostly West Coast stuff?
I've only done it on the West Coast.
Okay.
Yeah, I've stayed at squats on the East Coast, but I only have experience, squatting myself like on the West Coast.
Okay. I was curious. Adventures with Jane in the chat is wondering if it's easier to squat on the West Coast versus the East Coast, or if it doesn't matter. Midwest, wherever. I mean, as far as I know, like the biggest like cities where that have a squatting community are probably, I don't know how the Bay Area is anymore. Maybe the two of you could fill in that question mark, but I would say otherwise like Philadelphia and New
Mhm.
Orleans. Although New Orleans is probably getting a little sparse by now, but I don't know. What do you think? Like, what do you think about? Is there a lot of? Is it possible to squat still in the San Francisco Bay Area?
In the city of San Francisco, I don't think so. I would highly recommend against even trying. Um, Oakland, you still can, but I think it's gotten harder.
Yeah.
But beyond the comparison between like the East Coast versus the West Coast, just in terms of like city to city and town to town, all the old major metropolitan cities are becoming incredibly gentrified and incredibly difficult to squat or even rent in as a poor person. And I'm actually starting to see the squatting like picking up in suburbs and medium small towns that never had a history of it before.
Interesting. I think that makes a lot of sense. What do you think, Ren?
Um, yeah, I would say that it's become harder to squat in the Bay Area. Is it possible? Yeah, absolutely. There are like, always people squatting everywhere, and there are lots of people who squat who like aren't involved in like a squatters community at all, right? So like you don't really like hear about those places as much because like unless you know that person and like they tell you that they're squatting, you wouldn't actually know that about them. Like there was a lot of squatting also happening in like Oakland and that sort of thing. Just like people who were part of a squatters community, but also people who weren't, like, I mean, you could have like anyone you could think of, like families, things like that. People like living in homes after they'd been foreclosed on, that like that, also I would say qualifies as like squatting, I mean, not in the sense that we think of it as, but in occupying a space, right? That you like don't have quote permission to be at or whatever, as ridiculous as that is, that like you can't occupy your own home. But yeah, I think it's just gotten a lot more difficult, and I do think that squatting has started to become like pushed out to like the periphery a bit more, to like places that maybe had some squatting before or didn't, but it's becoming easier and easier just because the cities are becoming like so gentrified. It's becoming hard to like find spaces that you can easily squat.
Mm-hmm. I'm a little bit curious. I mean, through your time with Homes Not Jails, and maybe even afterwards, like how many different places did each of you squat, and is there, or maybe how many did you just stay at, or the difference between the two? Ren, do you want to start?
Sure. I mainly stayed at one place for a long period of time, and then I stayed at another house after that. So I mainly stayed in two places that were like really some of the more stable squats that were sort of around in the city. There are other places that I might have like temporarily sort of stayed at, but like not for long periods of time, just like, visiting someone, that sort of thing. But I mainly stayed in two places, which I actually think was even kind of rare at that time. Like a lot of people were moving around more than I was. I just happened through like friends, etc., to like become connected with some pretty stable squats.
What about you, Stix?
Well, there was a total of 4 squat houses that I stayed at somewhat during the time that I was in San Francisco. One of them I stayed at a lot more than the other 3 combined. Of the other 3, there was only one that ended up lasting for a long period of time. The other 2 didn't really take off. They got closed down in a matter of like a couple months or so.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. Forgive me if I'm jumping around here a little bit, but like, did either of you have any involvement with Hilarity House?
No.
Okay.
Like I'd been to Hilarity House, but did I have an involvement? No.
No, I couldn't even honestly tell you at this point, like if it was even in the same time period that you two are talking about. I can't quite remember, but I was just curious. I mean, because I think that's one of the ones I always heard about most.
I heard about them getting evicted shortly after I got to San Francisco.
Okay.
So it is around the same, like it was early 2012 that I think that house got closed down.
Yeah,
maybe
but
2012.
Yeah, I don't know when that house totally got closed down because they would get evicted and then they would like reoccupy it. And then it would like be like, oh, Hilarity's totally done now. It's like not coming back. And then, oh, it's back, you know?
Yeah, I heard that a couple of times myself.
So I got to visit it like before it was evicted. And I don't know. I think it did come back after that, you know? But I wasn't super involved with it or involved with it at all, really.
I'm kind of curious to know, like, through Homes Not Jail's actions, how many houses were each of you involved with? Just say like either opening up or just marching to bring attention to. I'm just kind of trying to kind of curious of like a general like ballpark number of maybe squats that you've been involved with.
Stix.
Well, I mean, I've been to 4 public building occupations. Houses that we were involved in opening up, it's so difficult to keep track of because sometimes like one person would spot a house and another person would go find a way to get in it. Sometimes you'd open a house up and then it would get locked back up again before anyone moved into it. Sometimes you'd open a house up and it wasn't nice. It wasn't up to your personal standards, but you could toss it down to somebody else who could use it, who just walked into a meeting needing a place to stay.
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard to
put a number on.
Put a number on, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Wren, did you have anything to comment on that?
Yeah, just that it's hard to like, it is really hard to keep track of because like there were periods where like, you know, we would like go out like, or I personally or others involved, like we would go out like 5 nights a week, you know, to like open up houses, and then that number could kind of dwindle the amount of times we went out a week. So like it's just a lot. And yeah, like the ones that became viable squats versus didn't, like super varied. Like, yeah, some of them would like instantly be discovered and like the locks totally changed. And then others, you know, you would like meet someone who, you know, needed to get into a place and then you just like never really quite heard from them again, but you know that they had keys to a spot, you know, that sort of thing.
Cool.
I can say I participated in opening one house that ended up being long-term during the time that I was in San Francisco. That like one that ended up being really, really good.
Cool. Interesting. You know, another person in the chat, actually Adventures with Jane, who's always joining us in the YouTube chat. Thank you for always coming in and watching. But they're wondering the types of people that squat empty buildings? People that live in squats, like, are they old, young, any veterans? Like, just generally, like, can you give us an idea of the types of people that need this type of housing? Like the types of people that you've ran into or lived with?
You see as many different types of people as you see on the streets. Mm-hmm. You'll see people that are older, you see people that are younger, you see people that are male, female, straight, queer, that are doing it out of desperation, that are doing it out of choice, that are I see people that are sober, I see people that are on drugs, I see people that are able-bodied or disabled. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, people always ask me, like, what does a traveler look like? And I'm like, you'd be surprised. It's not all just punks, most of people are just normal, everyday people, just like you're saying, and so, every squat I think I've lived in, not every squat, but I would say I lived in a lot of punk squats, but overall, like, people are just people, so, and someone else, our friend Jason, actually, in the chat, who actually has co-hosted with me in the past, is wondering what the process is like when squats get shut down. Do the police come and try to arrest people, or do people just leave once notices are stapled on the door? How does that all go down usually?
I would say that it really depends, like, you could spend the night in a place and then all of a sudden the next, a few days go by and, like, the property manager are there and they, like, tell you to get out, or the police are there, like, relatively quickly, and they just, like in San Francisco, it was, like, pretty rare to get arrested for squatting, in my opinion, at that time, like, so long as you, like, left and you did leave and you didn't sort of, like, fight that, mm-hmm. It wasn't like, or you would have places that, like, had established, like, some question of tenancy, and they would go through a whole formal eviction process that, like, any other sort of, like, tenant would go through. And then you also had people with squats who chose to, like, a landlord or somebody would come, or a property owner, and they would try to negotiate with you in a thing called, like, cash for keys, where they would pay you to move out, like, a certain amount of money, and you would negotiate with them because it was cheaper for them to do that than go through eviction proceedings with you. I mean, I personally never did, like, cash for keys, but there are people who did choose to do that.
I've heard of that program. I don't know anyone personally that's done it, but I've heard of it mentioned.
I've never heard of anyone getting arrested just for, like, living at a squat that was discovered, and
that wasn't part of an action.
Yeah, my understanding is that the only law you're really breaking is trespassing, which by itself is an incredibly minor charge, and isn't something that you really do time for, even if you're convicted of. And usually the owner of the building isn't that interested in pressing charges. They just want you out. Sometimes the owner comes and nails a board over the front door, and you have to break back in to get your stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And sometimes you do get notices on the door. That's a thing that happens.
So what do you do when that happens?
You've got no choice. You got to break back in and get your stuff.
Yeah. Or, like, in
the every time.
Yeah, you have to go back and get your stuff. Sometimes it's kind of laughable because it's already been ruled sort of a civil issue, not, like, a criminal issue. So, like, you'll get this, like, note that's like, you have to leave within, this amount of like within a 24 hours, and like you have to go, and like it's just like they don't really have the ability to sort of enforce that. So you just kind of like laugh at it and throw it in the trash and just like wait to see if they'll like start to have a more formal process with you or not. Like,
Yeah. It's Sticks. It's funny that I specifically remember coming back to several places that have been boarded up and having to break in to get my stuff. Yeah, it definitely has happened a bunch of times. But I'm kind of curious. You'd mentioned a bunch of stuff at the beginning of the show that you wanted to touch on. Is there anything that we missed that you wanted to like talk about?
Nothing that I can call to mind now.
Okay. Wren, did you have anything that you wanted to touch on that maybe something that people you'd like the audience to know that about squatting? Or anything that we missed that you wanted to talk about?
Sticks, would you want to go over maybe like some of this? I don't know if you'd want us to go over this, but like some of the steps to sort of identifying a vacant property and like evaluating it. I don't know if that would be helpful or not.
Yeah, I think so.
You'll help me with this, Sticks?
Sure. Well, there's the most obvious things that even somebody who doesn't do this knows, that if they've got piled up papers or mail on the porch, or overgrown weeds, or boards in the windows, or it just looks dirty and run down in general.
Some other things might even be like looking at like some of the landscaping might be kept kind of good, sort of, but like other parts of it, like you'll notice like in the driveway, like there's a bunch of weeds growing up that if you were in use frequently, the weeds would kind of be crushed down. Same with like major sort of walkways that you can like look at, you can look at mail and see the like date that it was sent on to have an idea of like how long it's been since people started getting mail. Another thing which is really cool when it happens is when you can hear like what we'd call like birdies, so like which are like fire alarms that are losing batteries that are chirping, and so you can like walk by a house. I still do it today. Like I just hear them everywhere, like I just like I'm so used to hearing it. But so in some of them you have to get closer to the house, but like if somebody's living in a house like that's not really gonna last very long.
No,
like, you're gonna get annoyed and like either like crush your fire alarm or change the batteries. Like,
that's funny. That's one I had not thought about for sure. Yeah. I think
it takes a trained ear to recognize.
Yeah. An interesting tip that I do remember from a documentary called Better Squats and Gardens that I had seen.
That's awesome.
Yeah, this was back before YouTube, so I don't know where it is now. But it was a brilliant name for a documentary. But it's like a 30-minute thing. But one of the things I do remember about it was people were saying, what to look out for. And one of the things that they mentioned was checking the power meter to see if the power meter was moving or not. Obviously, if it wasn't moving, then it's just another thing to add to your list of indicators of whether the building was occupied or not.
Yeah.
Sort of on that line, another thing that we would do is we would a lot of times like put a piece of tape near doorways or entrances, like on the very bottom of the frame. And so if you come back and the tape hasn't been broken, it means that at least that nobody's accessed it in X amount of days, or like sticking like a piece of paper precariously sort of in a gate or something that would fall out if you moved it. Right. And so like that compared with like that kind of combined with like tape on entryways and stuff too.
Yeah, that reminds me of this. I don't know if either of you've seen those movies where the person always puts a matchstick in the door.
Mm.
Yeah, that works. Or just any piece of garbage,
Yeah,
like a piece of plastic wrapper in between the door and the door frame.
yeah. I for some reason in Hollywood it was always a matchstick, and I don't know why that is, but I've seen it in several movies, and I was just like, huh, interesting. Uh,
Yeah.
um, I'm kind of curious, like, for the people that are listening to the show, I think a lot of them are going to be travelers that are kind of living in like short term one night stand squats. But I do think my whole involvement in squatting and just becoming like really interested in the history and the activism portion came through traveling and meeting other people that were squatting. And I'm kind of curious, like, if either of you have like any advice for people that would like to get involved with the squatting movement in some form or another.
Well, on what you said, that most of our listeners are probably going to be travelers. I think it actually helps to stick around in one place for a while and like really get to know the ins and outs of a city that you're living in, and put down roots, get to know all the neighborhoods, that you're not just squatting the house that you're in, you're essentially squatting the whole city.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot that you take from your surroundings in general when you're living that lifestyle, aside from just the place where you sleep at night.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Another thing too, like especially like shorter term places, you'll just be in for a night or two, but like to start off sort of covertly squatting a place, like being pretty careful with your comings and goings and like the amount of light that you use at night, especially if you're like in a more well populated sort of area or like really visible, because people in the neighborhood probably know that the place is vacant, right? So like if you're just going to be there for a night or two, it's like better to like, go in after dark and like leave early in the morning, covertly. And also like there are a lot of things you could do like that are pretty simple, like putting up, like if there are like blinds and things like that, you can put up like black trash bags behind it and like tape them to the walls so that you can like create like a room where you can at least like have light, and sort of like
Mm-hmm.
function in. But that, slowly as you get used to a squat and you start to sort of like get to know and observe the neighborhood, to like slowly become more overt over time.
Yeah. I always, through the squatting movement in Philadelphia, I always learned how important it was to talk to and get to know your neighbors when squatting. And community support was always like one of the number one most important things that you could do, at least in that area. Because whenever people did come to finally kick people out of a squat, you could make a bunch of calls and try and get as many people from the neighborhood to show up and at least cause a PR scare. You know what I mean? Sometimes it would make the owners or the police or whatnot like back off. I think you'd probably agree that's a pretty good tactic. I mean, if you're planning on doing like a long-term squat, it's like community support.
Yeah, for sure. And some communities can be like more welcoming than others. Another thing too is like with a community, like you don't necessarily have to, you could, but you don't necessarily have to like tell them that you're squatting necessarily, but you could say like, oh yeah, we just moved in. Like this is
Mm-hmm.
our new house that we're renting, etc. Right? And like make a show of like moving in and like showing some sort of occupancy that looks like, legal occupancy. And get to know them and interact with them like anyone else who'd be moving into the neighborhood.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
Definitely.
if the community is not going to be receptive to squatting, if you can get them to be receptive to you, that would make a big difference.
That's an interesting way to put that. Yeah. Yeah. Because dealing with people on a one-on-one basis, like obviously humanizes and makes you a real person. So instead of like that crazy weird figure living in the abandoned buildings down the street. So yeah.
Yeah.
It makes a difference how you look too. That
Yeah.
Yeah. It makes you more approachable,
like,
I would assume.
I mean, a lot of people, if they find out somebody's squatting next door to them, their first concern is that it's going to be a drug house.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I've some of the stories I've always heard of neighbors that are down with people squatting is always you always hear people say, well, at least it's not going to be open to a crack house or something, if they're like improving the house and whatnot. And so I'm kind of curious, do both of you still live in like the San Francisco area or the Bay Area right now?
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
I live sort of on the periphery of the Bay Area now.
The reason I ask is just because there is some people that are kind of wondering who they can talk to about this stuff in that area. Like you were talking about that space before that had like tools and whatnot. And are there any resources or people to talk to nowadays that Homes Not Jails really isn't a thing anymore?
Let's.
I mean, my first inclination would be, I don't live in the area though, obviously, but my first inclination would be to maybe tell people to go, check out like an info shop, maybe like the Long Haul, and ask around there, see if they can find resources.
Yeah, or they could go just to the Omni Commons and sort of ask around. I don't know if like open meetings are still being held once a week at the Omni Commons. But I know that like the East Bay sort of Homes Not Jails still has sort of stuff and resources stored there. Also, the East Bay Homes Not Jails has there's like a Facebook group, or not a group, there's a Facebook page, I guess, that people are sort of still keeping up. And so sort of like reaching out through that page would like, be a good way for people to connect to people who sort of actively have access to resources in the area.
Yeah, definitely. Awesome. Well, I think I don't know. I feel like we got some really interesting stories and whatnot. I'm actually, I did have one that I'm just thinking of now. One question for y'all, and I was wondering if you have any horror stories of squatting, whether it's just like a really crappy house, or just maybe bad roommates, or bad police interactions, anything like that.
All of the above. How would you answer that, Stix?
Stix, did you have anything on that?
Well, roommate situations are always kind of complicated, and I think it would take a drawn out amount of time to go through those dynamics. I have been hauled up inside of a house that I broke into while the police were like circling the perimeter, shining flashlights in all the windows. I have been dangling from a third-story window, hanging from a pipe. I have been locked inside of a house.
Yeah, that's happened to me too. Yeah. I was telling a story about that last week. What's the story behind the hanging on the pipe thing? Can you touch on that? I'm curious.
That was the only way in. That was
okay. So it wasn't like you were trying to leave; you were trying to get in.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, that sounds sketchy. Ren, Ren, did you have any a story or anything you wanted to share about that?
Oh God, there are really so many things. It would like take many podcasts, but I can think of one particularly it's sort of a funny story, I guess, but it also, I don't know if it, like, I remember one time, like, we went out one night with somebody who, like, didn't, they, like, needed housing and they didn't really know, like, a lot about squatting at the time. And so, like, kind of, like, had access to this place or, like, helped them get access that night. I don't really remember to a spot, right? And so we, like, got them all settled in this house and they were, like, all good, And so we, like, left and, they had the keys and it was their house, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, later this person sort of, like, gives us a call and was like, like, I had to leave, like I had to go, like it was really, like, I don't remember why. I honestly can't remember. I don't remember why it was that they had to leave, but they called and were like, yeah, I had to go and all this stuff. And then what came out in that call was that they had left the oven on and running, and that they had left the house without turning off the oven. And so we were all like, oh no, and it was like super late, but like we're really like, like nobody wants to like burn down a city block, right? Or like buy a whole house, So it was like, oh God, And so you had to like go back and like turn the oven off. And it was just like, when they called, it was like already super late. So it was like kind of getting into like almost those sort of daylight hours where you really don't want to be out. So yeah, that was sort of one of the funnier times we had.
So they told you they left the oven on.
Well, like we had like after having like sort of an extended conversation with this person about like why they left and like what was going on, and they had in that conversation they talked about like that they were sitting in like the kitchen with the oven on and open so that they could warm the place, right? Because they were super cold. And then it came up, and then like sort of thought to ask like, oh, okay, well, did you turn the oven off? And it was like, and the person's like, no, I got out of there as quickly as possible. And that place actually ended up being a viable spot for some months for like another person who like lived there super successfully. So that was good. But like, yeah, that's cool. Was like one of those moments. Like,
what do you think about the sewage backup, Ren? Would that make a good story right now?
Awesome story. Or what we call the shit pit.
The shit pit?
Yeah.
So
my gosh.
This house had a sewage backup that went unnoticed for a long time because it had a sewage pump. Like two floors of the house were below street level, and it had a sewage pump that pumped their sewage up to the main. Okay. And the sewage pump was down in a hole that had like a lid over it. So where it first leaked was in the sewage pump, and it buried itself in sewage. Uh-huh. And we noticed the smell, but didn't notice where it was coming from until sewage came out of a drain that was also frequently clogged with leaves. When it would rain, you'd have to go poke it with a stick or something. So when we just saw the patio flooding, it didn't immediately register that something was wrong. And as it kept getting bigger and bigger and creeping towards our house, and then coming up our bathtub drain.
Oh no! Oh
man!
We
realized that it was sewage.
And it started like it just like just grew to like massive proportions.
What? How massive?
Well, we had a friend who was a plumber who just came to look at it, just to see what the situation was. And he said he'd never seen something on that scale ever.
I mean, we talking about scale. I mean, is it like filling the bathtub or like?
Well, it wasn't just, it was, the biggest problem was that back patio. Cause like, there were like these doors that open up to a back patio that were like, the doors were flush with like the patio. Uh-huh. And so it just kept building up like inches of sewage. Just like.
To the back
It was a few inches deep, maybe 20 feet wide pool in the back patio. And also filled the downstairs bathroom. There was a few points where it crept in to the back door
Oh
of
my
the
God.
house.
So it was outside
And
mostly, right?
Yeah, but there
yeah, and there was
the living room of the house.
there was one point when it started spewing out of a crack on the sidewalk too, and that was
Oh my
when
God.
the bank got cited for it. They came and posted a fine on the door, and it's like a work order for the bank to clean up and fix the problem. So they had to, while we were living there, hire like a roto-rooter to come suction all the sewage out of our backyard and sprinkle this powdered disinfectant all over the place, and then fix our sewage pump.
Wow.
Meaning replace the sewage pump because it was unfixable from being submerged in sewage for however many months.
Yeah, there was also a shower in another unit that also had shit coming up out of it.
Oh man.
Yeah.
That sucks.
And the roto-rooter guys who came to clean it up also said, like, their jaws dropped. They said, "We've never heard of a sewage backup this bad."
And when they like looked in like where the sewage pump was and stuff, you know, like there also was other stuff that maybe people had been flushing down the drain, like a ton of like condoms and stuff too, that was just like,
oh my gosh,
all over the place. And like it got to points where it, like, had to kind of like shovel out the sewage so it like wouldn't overtake the unit, you know?
Oh
the,
yeah.
like, apartment. Like it was gnarly. Like
yeah,
like,
when it started creeping into the house, we had to bucket brigade it like out over the back fence.
Where did the back fence lead to?
A church. So it was like their planter box. We were dumping the sewage in their flower planter.
you like really learned like, how good of friends you had if they'd come and didn't even live there and like bail out your shit, you know? Like,
oh my gosh, that's pretty great. Oh man. Oh well. On that note, I think unless there's anything else you guys want to touch on, I think we can leave it off at that.
Yeah. Do you have anything else, Wren?
no, I don't have anything else.
Okay. Cool. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to join me today and tell us some of these wonderful stories.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Totally. Anytime. And, I hopefully people listen to this, maybe it'll trigger some interest in looking more into squatting, maybe not just for a place to stay, but maybe as a political act, and kind of help the movement go along. Just out of curiosity, have either of you read like any books on squatting, like maybe like Cracking the Movement or anything like that?
I read the book that was about the formation of homes, not jails, and a book that I really liked was actually a graphic novel called War on the Neighborhood by Seth Tabachman.
Ah, yes.
Set in New York's Lower East Side.
Mm-hmm. That is an excellent book / comic. I've actually met Seth Tabachman a couple of times. And always really interesting person to talk to. I do love those stories though. World War III Illustrated, and You Don't Have to Fuck People Over to Survive are excellent resources that people should just definitely check out. I like if you have time, I would say check out Cracking the Movement. I forget the author, but it's a really excellent book about squatting in the I think mid 80s to early 90s in Europe, and a lot of really interesting stories of fighting the police, interesting stories of fending off like landlord goon squads and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. So a very interesting book. And yeah, I don't know, Ren, if you had anything that you wanted to suggest that people check out off the top of your head.
Oh God, off the top of my head, I don't really know. I remember reading like when I first started squatting about like a book that was about like take back the land, which is like a sort of like, I think it was like a movement mostly like in the South to like occupy land and like get land back basically. And so I read that, and then definitely like more on the city. I can't really think necessarily. Oh, H&J also does have a zine about squatting.
Yeah, I've seen them randomly throughout the year for, I don't know, for like, or just randomly I'll come across one traveling, but I haven't seen one in a few years. So I don't know where people could find one nowadays.
Oh, do you know Stix? Because there was one that like when we were involved in H&J, like it really was like, because there were ones that people wrote sort of like individually and stuff, but it like really was like an active effort by like most of the people who were involved in H&J at the time, which is pretty awesome.
Is it still on the old website?
Does the old website exist?
I couldn't find one personally.
I know it stayed up for a long time after anyone was actively managing it.
Yeah. One of the things is that we have a file library at Squat the Planet. So I don't know if either you want to check that out at some point. We do have a section on squatting with a lot of squatting zines in it. And it's kind of like a place where I try to archive zines that have been scanned and stuff. So if we did find one at some point for Homes Not Jails, I would love to add that to the archive.
I do have it in digital format. I can get it to you.
That'd be awesome.
If you want to see a digital copy of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I would, if I could upload it to our little file library, that would be wonderful.
Sure, I'll get on that.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, thank you both for being here and entertaining us, and hopefully giving some people some inspiration.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys, everyone, for listening. That's listening right now. Thank you for tuning in again this week. This has been the 8th episode of the Squat the Planet podcast, and hopefully we will see you all next week. Until then, safe travels.
Peace.
Bye.